To begin with, I want to ask one important question. The question is this: what is life? What is life? Can you think of a moment? What is life? Many people describe life as a journey. Can you say it together? Life is a journey.
Life is journey.
Yes, many people describe life as a journey. It is not something that stands still, but something that moves forward step by step. For example, Peter Scotcher, a pastor and counselor, he described life in this way for Christianity. He said that the Christian life is like a journey filled with various experiences, movement, detours, and transformation. One more time. The Christian life is a journey filled with various experiences, movement, detours, and transformation. Likewise, this description fits our lives very well. As we walk through life, we encounter many different seasons and circumstances. Some seasons are joyful and full of hope, while others are difficult and confusing. One of these seasons is what the Bible often calls the wilderness. Wilderness. In other words, there are times in our lives when we found ourselves in a wilderness season, a time of difficulty, uncertainty, and testing. During this moment, the path is not clear. We may feel lost, tired, or even afraid. Sometimes we do not understand why we are going through this wilderness journey at all. Yet even in the wilderness, God is with us. God is with us. The wilderness is not a place where God abandons us. Instead, it is often a place where God meets us, teaches us, and shapes our faith. Though we may not understand the season we are in, God remains faithful. One more time. Though we may not understand the season we are in, God remains faithful. Therefore, God calls us to trust Him, even in our wilderness journey. He asks us to walk by faith, not by sight, believing that He is leading us, guiding us, and preparing us for what lies ahead. Especially today, we can find the wilderness journey through this passage. So let us maintain the wilderness and God through this passage. So let us read book of Exodus chapter 13 and verse 18 one more time. Ready, go. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up to the land of Egypt, equipped for battle. Today, we are meditating on God's salvation story for the Israelites, for the people of Israel. This passage is not merely a historical account, but a revelation of how God saved His people, how God leads His people, and how God remains present with His people. Therefore, in order to understand this passage correctly, we must remember both God and the Israelites. First of all, let us begin by considering the Israelites. What happened to the Israelites? What happened to the Israelites? At that time, the Israelites had lived as slaves in Egypt for a very long time. They suffered under forced labor and oppression. They cry out to God in their pain, and although it may have seemed as if God was silent, God never forgot His people. God never forgot His people. God heard their cries and remembered His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and acts in His perfect time. Through mighty signs and wonders, God finally compelled King Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. When King Pharaoh allowed them to leave Egypt, it was truly good news for Moses, who had been called as their leader, and for the Israelites, who had endured years of suffering. It was a good news. They were finally free from slavery, and a new future seemed to open before them. One more time. They were finally free from slavery, and a new future seemed to open before them. For example, let us read Exodus chapter 13 and verse 17. Radical. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not let them by way of the land of Philistines, although there was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. At that moment, the Israelites were ready to leave Egypt and journey toward the land of Canaan. From a human perspective, there was an obvious and logical route to take. As you can see in the map, the shortest and most direct route from Egypt to Canaan passed through the land of the Philistines. The land of the Philistines. This route was commonly used, efficient, and fast. And you making plans based on logic and efficient will naturally choose this route. Geographically speaking, the shortest and easiest route from Egypt to Canaan was through the land of the Philistines. It was a dialect route commonly used by caravans. It looked efficient, logical, and practical. If we are planning to the journey, we would have chosen that road immediately, passing through the land of the Philistines. However, God had a different plan. God had a different plan. Let us read verse 17 one more time together. Ready, go. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although there was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Although the way through the land of the Philistines was near, God intentionally chose not to lead them that way. So I have one question. So why did God refuse the shortcut? Especially the Bible clearly tells us the reason. On verse 17 it said that lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Especially, the land of the Philistine was filled with strong and warlike armies. The Israelites had just left slavery. They had no military training, no battle experience, and no emotional readiness for war. Also, this passage reveals the deep compassion and wisdom of God. To be specific, God knew the weakness of His people. God knew the weakness of His people. God understood their limitation. God did not shame them for their weakness, but instead protect them because of it. Therefore, the Israelites could organize themselves into groups, but that did not mean they were prepared to fight. God's decision was not a denial of blessing, but an act of mercy. From a human point of view, the shortcut through the land of Philistines seemed wise and practical. However, from God's point of view, it was dangerous. It was dangerous. And that's why God refused the shortcut. Therefore, God always sees what we cannot see, and God always knows what we are not yet ready to face. Especially, we can find God's new plan for the Israelites. So what was God's plan? Instead of leading them on the shortest road, God led them Israelites by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. For example, let us read Exodus chapter 13 and verse 18, our passage today. Ready, go. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up to the land of Egypt, equipped for battle. Can you believe it? It was the wilderness. As you can see on the map, it was the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Therefore, the Israelites had to turn around to the land of Canaan. Yes, it was the wilderness. To be specific, God decided to lead the Israelites through the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. As you can see on the map, the Israelites had to turn around to arrive in Canaan by passing through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Of course, it might take a long time. Also, the wilderness was not easy to pass by neither. The wilderness was not an easy place. The wilderness was not comfortable, predictable, and safe. The wilderness meant a longer journey, uncertainty, and hardship. Therefore, the Israelites had to turn away from the obvious road and follow God into a place that looked empty and difficult. Even though Moses and the Israelites may not have fully understood God's new plan, they chose to obey and follow where God led them. They decided to obey, to follow God's plan. Yet this was God's chosen direction. Even though Moses and the Israelites may not have understood God's plan, they obey. They follow where God led them. However, the wilderness was not meaningless. The wilderness, it was a place of preparation. It was a place where God would shape His people, teach them, to depend on Him and preparing them for what was ahead. What appeared to be a delay was actually protection. That's why they were able to equip for battle. What looked like a detour was actually divine guidance. God's plan was perfect, even when it did not make sense at first. It was a place where God would train them, shape them, and teach them to trust Him. Sometimes what feels like delay is actually God's protection. Also, we can find the purpose of God's plan. So what was the purpose of God's plan? Let us read Exodus chapter 13 and verse 21. Ready, go. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they may travel by day and by night. When the Israelites decided to follow God's plan to the wilderness, God was there with them. To be specific, God wanted to be with them in His plan. One more time, God wanted to be with them in His plan. That's why God revealed Himself through His presence. Likewise, God Himself went before His people. As you can see in the picture, the pillar of cloud and fire was not merely a symbol or sign sent by God. It was a visible manifestation of God's own presence. There were not two different pillars, but one pillar that appeared as a cloud by day and a fire by night. This pillar guided the Israelites, protect them, and reassure them that God was with them every step of the way. Even when the road seemed strange or confusing, the Israelites could trust the journey because God was leading them. God was leading them. Those whom God brings into the wilderness, He does not abandon them there. Therefore, God took responsibility for guiding, protecting, and sustaining His people. The Israelites did not need to fear getting lost because God went before them. They did not need to fear the darkness because God gave them light through the pillar of fire. They did not need to fear their enemies because God was their defender on their wilderness journey. So today, we meditate on God's salvation story. God chose a new plan, the wilderness for the Israelites. Therefore, the Israelites were able to keep safe on their wilderness journey. However, this salvation story did not end yet. It still teaches us to live as Christians today. First of all, trusting God in the wilderness. Can you say together? Trusting God in the wilderness. Trusting God in the wilderness. As the Israelites decided to pass through the wilderness toward the Red Sea, we should also trust God in our wilderness journey. To be specific, the Israelites decided to trust God's new plan in their wilderness. Therefore, we should also trust God's plan in our wilderness. So I have one question. What is the wilderness? What is the wilderness? According to the dictionary, wilderness refers to an or passless space. So I have one question. Have you ever been to the wilderness? For example, I had a chance to visit Grand Canyon before, and I had to pass by the wilderness area. As you can see the picture, there was nothing in the wilderness. There was nothing in the wilderness. Especially when we think about the wilderness, as a Christian, we might encounter a spiritual wilderness in our lives. Can you say together? Spiritual wilderness. So what is spiritual wilderness? Especially the concept of a spiritual wilderness in the Bible often symbolizes a period of testing, trial, and transformation. Can you say together? A period of testing, trial, and transformation. As Christians, we may experience spiritual wilderness during times of failure, loss, illness, broken relationship, or unanswered prayers. In the wilderness, we may feel devastated, lost, sad, and alone. Sometimes we may even feel as though God has abandoned us or does not care about us. The Israelites may feel the same way when God led them away from the familiar road and into the wilderness. They may have asked themselves why God chose such a difficult path. Yet God was working even when they could not see it. So I have one question for everyone. Have you ever experienced spiritual wilderness in your lives? For example, I want to share my story once again. As you know, last 3 years ago, in 2023, I tried to follow my own plan. Therefore, I decided to go back to Chicago and plant Ordinary Church there. Of course, it was a good plan to continue to serve Ordinary Church in Chicago, and it actually happened. So I worshiped there for 3 months. However, it failed because of my marriage plan failed. Therefore, I lost hope and I did not know what to do. Therefore, I decided to come back to Korea on May. At the time, I was in the midst of the spiritual wilderness. I did not know what to do. I had a panic disorder as well. Nevertheless, I trust in God once again in the wilderness. Especially God spoke to me one verse through other pastor. It was a verse from Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. It said that when we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. Yes, God had another plan for my life. By God's grace, I was able to serve Ordinary Church once again here in Seoul. Also, God sent a new congregation in His plan. Yes, God was there with me on my wilderness journey. The reason why I share my story once again is because God also wants us to trust Him in our spiritual wilderness. Of course, as the Israelites walked through the wilderness toward the Red Sea, we might encounter the season of wilderness. Nevertheless, God wants us to trust Him, not give up. Not give up. That's why the Israelites decided to trust God once again on their wilderness journey. Likewise, we should continue to trust God in our wilderness journey. In other words, we should continue to follow God's plan in our lives. Especially, I want to share one short clip of Mark, who is a pastor at Life Faith coming Catholic Church in Chicago and president at Moody Bible Institute, where I studied before in Chicago, he shared the purpose of God during his sermon. So let us hear his words first.
Fear not, because God's interruptions carry divine purpose. You may not know why it's happening right now, but 5 years from now, you'll look back at something that was disruptive and say, thank God for that, because that rerouted me, and now I know why it happened. In the moment of disruption, you don't know, but years down the road, you say, aha, now I know. This was all part of God's purpose and plan to reroute me in the direction that he wanted me. In the moment, it feels confusing, but with time, you'll start to see the hand of God in it. Fear.
Likewise, God had a better plan for us. As God led the Israelites into the wilderness toward the Red Sea, God will also lead us according to his good plan. Even though we have to walk through the wilderness, we should trust God in our wilderness. Trusting God in the wilderness. And secondly, God is always with us. Can you say together? God is always with us. When the Israelites decided to walk through the wilderness, God was with them. In the same way, God is always with us in our circumstance. Especially, we should remember our God first. Who is God? For example, let us read Exodus chapter 13 and verse 18. Ready, go. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea, and the people of Israel went up to the land of Egypt, equipped for battle. Especially when Moses used the word God, he used Hebrew term Elohim. Can you say together? Elohim. The name Elohim, it refers to God's power and he is mighty. God's power and he is mighty. Likewise, God had the power to save the Israelites. That's why God chose a new plan for the Israelites in order to save them. In the same way, God has the power to save us from our troubles. However, there was more of it. Especially, we can find one of God's attributes in the story today. Can you say together? God is omniscient. Can you say together? God is omniscient. Yes, God knows everything. God knows everything. That's why God knew how weak the Israelites were. Therefore, God led them by the wilderness toward the Red Sea. In the same way, God knows us. He knows our circumstance. God knows our weakness. God knows our trouble. And God knows what we need the most in our circumstance. Furthermore, God knew that the Israelites needed guidance in the wilderness. That's why God revealed himself through the pillar of fire and cloud to be with them. Especially, we should remember one Latin phrase in this story. Can you say together? Coram Deo. Can you say together? Coram Deo. Yes, coram Deo. It refers to being in the presence of God. Can you say together? In the presence of God.
In the presence of God.
Especially when God revealed the pillar of fire and the cloud, it refers to God's presence. In Korean, 하나님의 임재. The Israelites were able to walk in the wilderness because of God's presence. His presence dwelt in every step of the Israelites. In the same way, we should also live with coram Deo. In other words, we live in the presence of God. His presence always dwells in our wilderness journey. No matter how we are struggling with our troubles, God is always there for us. Especially, Jesus also mentioned his presence in the New Testament. For example, let us read Matthew chapter 28 and verse 20, Radical, teaching them to observe that I command you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. I am with you always. At that time, Jesus also promised to be with them through his presence. Even though he had ascended to heaven, likewise, Jesus was with his people through his presence. In the same way, Jesus, God, is always with us through his presence. Therefore, we should not worry about our trouble or wilderness journey anymore, since God is always with us. For example, Jerry preached a pastor, he mentioned the purpose of God. He said that God does not walk away and leave us to the mercy of uncontrolled random or chance events. Yes, God never leaves us. God never leaves us. God is always taking care of us in our wilderness journey. Therefore, we only need to trust and follow God in our circumstance. That's why we praise God together. Can you say together? God is with us. God is on our side. He will make a way for all we know, for all we hope. He has done great things. Yes, God is always with us and on our side. Let us live with confidence in the presence of God. We should not fear our troubles in our wilderness journey, since God is always with us. And finally, I want to share one video clip once again. I showed this clip last year, but I want to show one more time. So let us watch again, and then let us have time to pray together. Let us watch together.
Sometimes I wish that I could freeze the picture and save it from the funny tricks of time, slipping through my fingers all the time. Sometimes I wish.
Yeah, I just see the picture clip. Yes, God has been faithful to us from the beginning, and now it is our turn to respond in faith in our wilderness journey. Therefore, I have one final question for everyone. Are you ready to trust God in the wilderness journey? Yes. Trusting God in the wilderness, follow God's plan. 그런데요, God is always with us. Can you say together? Trusting God in the wilderness. Can you read it together? Ready, go. Trusting God in the wilderness, follow God's plan. 그런데요, God is always with us.